in Upadesa Saram, which is it's a short work of 30 verses that outlines the entire teaching, and Ramana wrote it. Actually, Upadesa Saram is the Sanskrit version. It was originally written in Tamil. It's called Upadesha Undiyar. I probably pronounced that wrong. But Upadesha Undiyar, which means it means the essence of the teaching. And then it was translated into Sanskrit, in which it's called Upadesa Saram. So those two texts are the same, but one's the Tamil version, Upadesha Undiyar, and then one's the Sanskrit version, Upadesa Saram. And Ramana talks about breath control. Breath control, one of the Sanskrit words for breath control is Pranayama. Anyone who's done yoga, well, you'll come across that word, Pranayama. It means control of prana. Prana means energy, the life force, or the breath. It's analogous to the Chinese concept of qi in Tai Chi or Qigong. And yama means control. So pranayama means control of the breath in this context. And Sarah's question is, should we do it? Is it something that's recommended? So this is a yoga. It involves the body. And the rule about yogas generally is, if you want to do it, you can do it. So if you're drawn to it, do it. Personally, I find it a very worthwhile technique. Following the breath, just watching the breath. You don't have to do much. You don't have to do all the fancy pranayama. There are loads of different yogic techniques where you inhale for so many seconds, you hold the breath for so many seconds, you exhale for so many seconds, you hold the breath out in exhalation for so many seconds, and then maybe you cover one nostril up and you cover another nostril up, and you can do all these things, which is also very good if you want to do that. But we don't need to do that. We just need to observe the breath and allow it to slow down. I think it's in Who Am I? Ramana says, breath control is merely an aid to self-inquiry. It's not self-inquiry. It's merely an aid to self-inquiry. I love that phrase. It's merely an aid. It's merely just helping you. An aid means it's helping you, right? That's what aid means. It's merely an aid to self-inquiry. And I remember when I first read this, I thought, well, I need all the help I can get. Merely an aid. But merely an aid means it's kind of a dismissive way of saying it. It's only an aid. It's only a help to self-inquiry. Well, if it's help to self-inquiry, I want to do that. Don't say merely an aid. But the reason he says that is because there comes a point where the breath has quietened the mind. When you've been following the breath and your mind becomes quietened, you don't want to then just carry on doing breath work for hours and days and months and years. It's not the end goal. It's a stepping stone, like all the yogas. Now, how does this dovetail with the self-inquiry thing? Because Ramana says, when you quiet, he goes, again, I think this is in Who Am I as well. Do let me know if I'm wrong. He says, when you quieten the mind using the breath control, when you use breath control as a means to quieten the mind, or if you chant a mantra to quieten the mind, the phrasing he uses when he gives a teaching often goes like this. He says, this will lead to a temporary quietening of the mind. and not permanent destruction of the mind, which is liberation. Mano nassa. He says this will lead to a temporary quieting of the mind, which is what is called mano laya, or mano laya. Mano laya. It's temporary quieting of the mind, as opposed to permanent destruction of ignorance. The mind means ignorance, remember. Temporary removal of ignorance versus permanent removal of ignorance. And Ramana says self-inquiry will lead to permanent removal of ignorance. But all these other ones, the yogas, they'll lead to temporary removal of ignorance, which is not a full removal of ignorance at all. And the reason is because of the self. Only self-inquiry reveals what you are in your nature. It takes you back to yourself, the subject. Whereas just sitting down, watching your breath, controlling your breath, doing pranayama, repeating a mantra, it might quieten your mind, but it doesn't attack your identity directly. Doesn't make sense. Whereas self-inquiry not only quietens your mind, but it attacks the identity, what you think you are, namely the erroneous I am the body-mind idea. So I just wanted to mention the difference. Sri Sadhu Om talks about this in the beautiful text Sadhana Saram. So we've got Sarah asked a question about Upadesa Saram. Upadesa means teaching. Saram means essence. So Upadesa Saram means essence of the teaching. Whereas Sri Sadhu Om has a book, Sadhana Saram. Sadhana means practice, and Saram means essence. It means the essence of spiritual practice. And towards the end of that text, he writes a bit about breath control, actually. There's a couple of sections on breath control which is really worth everyone checking out. And there's a section on, I think, temporary versus permanent removal of ignorance or something like that. And he explains that when you attend to the first person, which is the self, you go to the self. When you attend to the first person, which is the I am, the self, you go to the self, which is the I am. When you attend to second or third persons, which are all the other objects, like the breath or your mantras, then you go to that. You end up in Maya. Maya is the collection, collectively, all objects. You see? So remember Sri Sadhu Om's way of talking about it, the subject and the object. He talks about the first person being the subject, second and third persons being the objects. He says always attend to the first person, I am. That's self-inquiry, self-attendance. Attend to the self, abide as the self. When you attend to the objects, you end up in Maya. You end up in the objects. When you attend to the self, you end up as the self. This is basically, you see this throughout the Upanishads and the Vedas and the Vedic texts, the Vedic scriptures. What you meditate upon, you become. You meditate upon objects, you become objects. You go to objects. You end up living in Maya. You meditate on Maya, you end up in Maya. You meditate on Brahman, you meditate on the self, you go to the self. Both are potential in you. You have the potential to continue in Maya, and you have the potential to moksha, liberation, Brahman, realize the self. So pranayama, mantra recitation, needlework, all these things may quieten your mind, but they are all Maya. Just to sort of round up a bit of the teaching about pranayama. Pranayama is one of the eightfold path, the Patanjali's Ashtanga Yoga or Raja Yoga. So you've got pranayama, which is breath control, and then what's after that? It's pratyahara, which means basically it means withdrawing your mind from the sense objects and becoming more gathered within it. So it's turning within. And then you have what's next? Dharana, which means concentration. And it's the initial concentration on something. And then as that intensifies and becomes more focused and more concentrated and intensifies, that's called dhyana, which is meditation. This is when the concentration is intensified. And the last stage of Patanjali's Ashtanga Yoga or Raja Yoga is when that intensification intensifies furthermore and you end up in Samadhi, which is when you get totally one-pointed mind, totally collected, totally gathered. And this is when the vasanas are not active. The thoughts go. At that point in time, if you say, who am I? This is when self-realization can dawn. Because this is when the mind is quiet, gathered, calm, and clear, self-illuminating. It doesn't have to be a verbal who am I, but just some kind of turning within. You recognize your true nature. If you don't ask that question, or if your mind doesn't get it somehow, what will happen is that the seed of ignorance, which is the idea I am the body, does not get destroyed. You just end up as a body mind with a very still mind. And you say to yourself afterwards, you say, oh, I got into a really great samadhi then. I did a really good samadhi. I, the body mind, had a really good samadhi. In Vedanta, this is called yogic samadhi. You know how different groups like to argue with each other? Two groups that like to argue with each other sometimes are Vedanta and yoga, believe it or not. There's a lot of literature in Vedanta about why it's better than yoga. And what they're arguing against is the idea in yoga where if you are wedded or attached to this idea I am the body mind very strongly, and then you're into getting your samadhis, is materialistic yoga. You can get into a deep, deep samadhi, and then but you're never questioning are you the body mind or not. And Vedanta says you have to question are you the body mind. You have to inquire.